Maps. Try to go anywhere without them. Sure, you can get to places, especially if the terrain is familiar. However, venture outside of your normal or local neighborhood and your journey is one of trial and error. You wonder what is over there and over there and over there. And with each foray, you discover something new. New, but not necessarily helpful. Data is a form of mapping, and so is remote satellite imagery. Now combine the two, and your understanding of that place expands exponentially. Not just the place as a static point in time, but a minute-by-minute view of what happens in that place. So imagine the power that information gives to retailers and governments and insurance companies and so many others in knowing not just the place, but the place and minute-by-minute historical activity. It's as if Heisenberg's uncertainty principle suddenly became certain. Namely, you can now know the location and the speed of an object. Okay, that's a little stretch, but it's close to it. The power of that information also arms the holder of it with prescient knowledge. In other words, the ability to predict what will come next. It's a mind-boggling concept, and if Spark Geo, a Prince George, BC company, continues to deliver on the promise of marrying low Earth satellite imagery with trillions of bits of information into powerful diagnostic tools, then the holder of that information will be armed with a reliable looking glass. I invited Will Cadell of Spark Geo to join me for a conversation that matters about the power of accurate time, space, and velocity-based intel. Well, thanks for joining me. You know, I think for most people, the concept of geospatial mapping and data collection is so new that it's something that they don't understand. Let's start with a definition of exactly what that is, because it's as though it's a whole new form of mapping information.
Yes. Thanks for asking me on the show. It's new, but it's also ancient. We've been telling people where places are for centuries, for thousands and thousands of years. I mean, that's how we know where to hunt. That's how we collect food. Is how we collect all sorts of different things that have added to our lives. So the notion of location has been intrinsic to the human experience for forever. So it is ancient, but it is modern because things have changed. We used to write maps and they stayed static for a long period of time. So when we think about Thomson's map of Canada, it became one of the most valuable pieces of information of the era because it told the story of where the resources in Canada were and how one might cross Canada to access them. That simply wasn't understood in the same way before. Now, and that map continued to be used for a number of hundreds of years as a base for Government of Canada mapping exercises. Now, with the advent of devices and such, we find that maps can bring on a life of their own. With data moving and being captured by devices and being captured by the cloud, we find that maps aren't static anymore. Maps tell a living story of humanity, whether that be in retail, as you say, whether that be climate change. There are many different facets of geospatial that impact our everyday lives. And that's what we find so interesting about this notion of geospatial. I started Spark Geo a little over 10 years ago, notionally to put maps on the internet. And largely we're doing the same thing now, but really this notion of maps on the internet has expanded such a long way that, and frankly, we all have the internet in our pockets these days, that we're all sort of interacting with this notion of mapping, whether you know it or not, or whether it's a map that's coming back to you or not. This notion of dynamic geographic data empowering the user in some manner is incredibly prescient in how we sort of live our day-to-day lives.
Can you give me an example of, let's say, are you able to take a look at a particular street corner in a city like London, England, and say, this is exactly what is happening in that place through the course of a day. This is the activity of the countless number of people, which you'd be able to count and say, these are the kinds of activities that they're motivated or carry out based on the environment they're in, and then how does that arm somebody with information to say, well, I can meet another one of their needs?
Yeah, that's so. There's a couple of pieces to that. One, I would say that it is possible to do that. I would say right now, on the commercial side of things, you wouldn't necessarily know who those people are. So, you know that there's a crowd. You know that they're moving this way and that. Some of them are in vehicles, some of them are on foot, some of them are on bicycles. And they're typically moving through that location. They might be commuting, they might be going shopping, they might be sightseeing, they might be dropping kids off at daycare. Who knows what they're doing, but they're moving to that location. And yeah, you can determine at certain times of the day how busy a certain place might be. So yeah, if you wanted to empower that person by providing better transit at that location, or if you wanted to provide to them a way of meeting a need, whether it be coffee or a donut or whatever it is at that particular location. That information is somewhat available, but you might not know that that's Joe who is walking by there at that time, or you might not know that Joe's intention is X, Y, or Z. But what you do know is that there's a bunch of people who are moving. That is possible too. However, you also might not know that instantly either. You might have to wait a little bit of time to get that information through. There are technologies that allow you to know precisely what's happening with an individual, but one would have to be very careful around privacy at that point.
Well, yeah, I can imagine. I was hearing you say, we take this person, Joe, for example, and say, you may not know exactly who they are. I think that they would be happy to know that you don't know exactly who they are, but rather that you're looking at those kinds of activities so that you can make informed decisions, hopefully to improve that experience.
Yeah. And I think the safest way for commercial land, as I like to say, to think about geography is, and to think about nodes on a network and individuals on a network, and that talks to the Internet of Things as well to some extent, but to think about these things in aggregate. So I don't really want to know what Joe's doing. I want to know what the crowd's doing. And Joe's part of that crowd, great. That's a wonderful thing. But in reality, the crowd's more important because the crowd tells us, in general terms, is this a good place to put your new coffee shop? Is it a good place to put a new grocery store? That kind of stuff. So thinking about crowds and thinking about aggregates is a much safer place for a commercially oriented geospatial company to be operating.
Who really are the customers of this geospatial information? We talk about commercial applications, but what are the other applications of this kind of information that would be a benefit to, whether it's a nature conservancy or, a Boy Scout troop? I don't know, because it's, as I say, it's new to me too. So I'm trying to understand exactly how we can put this to work so that everybody gets the benefit of having, the best possible insights.
It's a fascinating question because it touches every single piece of your life, whether it's like doing like a GPS watch navigation thing, or whether it's locating your next store, or whether it's helping understand and measure climate change in some manner. All these things are overtly geographic questions. Spark Geo, my organization, our customers are typically technology companies who want to understand location to help them deliver a better service, whether they're a satellite company, whether they're a vehicle company who are deeply interested in mapping these days, or whether it be an organization who is feeling the pain of climate change financially and is fearful that the models that they had in place might not be as relevant in the coming years as they were before, which leads to a level of motivation to understand what is going on around them and how can they mitigate for some of those changes.
So you are relying on trillions of bits of information on an ongoing basis that's coming from so much of the movement of people using a mobile device. It starts to give you that information, and as I said in my introduction, you're marrying it with low Earth satellite remote sensing or imagery. How do you bring that stuff together and at the same time protect the identity of those people with their devices?
Well, it's actually a fascinating question. So I would have said 15 years ago, what we do today doesn't really exist. There was something, and there is something still called sort of geographical information systems, GIS. So you see a lot in government, in essence, digital mapping, which is like, I mean, and that's where I came out of. And that's still a very valid set of skills. You need to access lots of data. You need to put it into a mapping environment. You either create a digital map, put it on the internet, or you create paper map, stick it up in a boardroom. All that stuff is still happening overtly. But now we're in a place where data is flowing. So we have these three key complementary assets. One of them is the cloud. One of them is access to space. And one of them is the pervasive number of devices that we have. So we got 3.5 billion devices on Earth. That's 3.5 billion people collecting GPS data of their day-to-day lives. We have like 10 petabytes of imagery being captured of our planet every single day, capturing change of the planet. And we have now what we would call, conceptually infinite compute in the use of the cloud. And that allows us to pull all this stuff together and build pipelines of data. And then we can add into those pipelines valves, if you like, which allow us to sort of redirect data products to different places according to the relevance to a particular question we're answering. I sometimes like to tell people that we're the least contentious pipeline company in British Columbia. We build all these pipelines, we fill them full of data, and we throw them up in the sky. And it at this point has not been a problem yet. So that's a good way to think about it. It's a good way of visualizing how this data flows, because it is coming from one location and it's flowing to kind of a refining capacity where we turn it into something that's of overt human use, and then we ship that product out to whomever is of most interest to it. Does that help?
I like your analogy, the pipeline analogy, because I had recently come across I guess a clip or a quote from somebody saying, "Data is the new oil," and it is flowing. It's very, very valuable.
Well, it's an interesting question, because some people will argue that is oil, some people argue it's sand. So there's so much of it, it's actually hard to manage. It doesn't make so much sense anymore. So pulling out insight from that data is really the most pertinent question these days, and that's certainly where the financial sector is most motivated. And that's not just insight about individuals. That's insight about climate change. That's insight about tell me which parts of my real estate portfolio are at greatest risk from fire or from flood or from landslide, or from landslide as a result of fires causing floods. It's these geographic chains of events which are astonishingly hard to measure. Even on a local scale, they're quite complicated. But if you're to think about scaling that up to a province, certainly a province as complicated as British Columbia, and then a nation, and then the globe, things get pretty wacky pretty quick. So you do need to sort of balance it there.
Well, I know you have mentioned climate change 2 or 3 times so far, and I can't help but starting to think, I don't know if my device is recording the temperature where I am at. But if you have that real-time, on-the-ground information about places throughout the country, we've never had access to that kind of information. And it starts to give us a very, very accurate view of what's happening in a place minute by minute, day by day, month by month, you can start to build trends and see what the shifts are, and especially over time, that information is going to give you a very clear image of what's happening. Is that possible?
It's becoming more possible, I would say. Our ability to join things together in a meaningful way is becoming credible. Like I said, 10 years ago, it was incredible. Now it's more credible. So if we think about Hurricane Harvey in the Gulf region of the U.S., millions of people displaced, terrible storm, floods, enormous amount of floods. We talked to one of our kind of assurance associates, and they came to us and were sort of brainstorming about that event and how it affected them, and they weren't sure for 10 days how many hundreds of millions of dollars of capital they were going to have to move because of infrastructure at risk based off that event. But I think about it and I think, oh, that's really weird, because we know the land cover, we know the topography, we know where the rivers are, we know where the roads are, we know where the buildings are, we know where the storm is, we know everything about this equation, but we never put it together in advance, or we didn't think about it in as geographic a manner as we should have before it happened, and then it happens, and then we end up wasting an astonishing sum of money on putting things in the wrong place. And I think that's it's an overtly geographic question. Like, why did we put that stuff there and then not protect it in some manner, or not manage it in some manner to assure its future? Yet we continue to make decisions, sort of small thinking decisions in that manner. And we have all the tools now to put it all together. Like I said, this is a new thing. This market, these complementary assets that have kind of sort of merged into like a Venn diagram, and we're right in the middle of that Venn diagram. That never existed before. Now we have the ability to do the analysis with appropriate data sets. But I think that ability to the market now is astonishingly hard, because a lot of people are like, well, don't we already do that? Or why did we not know this information? Well, it's all there, but what we haven't done is assembled it in such a manner that the appropriate decision makers were empowered by it. And I think that's where organizations like mine are sort of facing what would I call it? Maybe even a marketing issue. Like, we have to get out in front of people and describe what our modern abilities are now, where we moved from this place where we were making static maps that didn't change back in Thomson's time for hundreds of years. Now, in modern times, they can live their own lives. But that means if they're living their own lives, it's not far off being able to judge what is likely to happen given certain scenarios. So that's where we come to your question, which is, can we start understanding what the future holds? Well, we don't have a crystal ball, but we do have an ability to start thinking about what we know happens. We know that water flows over concrete and gets absorbed by wetlands. So if we cover a wetland with concrete, big surprise, the water flows and it floods more stuff. So when we start thinking about these processes, and we're not, and we're thinking about them in a holistic geographic manner, then we get to a place where, yes, we can start judging what is likely to happen and why we should do things a little bit differently, especially in the face of what feels like a changing environment.
So just in the last couple minutes that we have here, why is BC perfectly situated for you to be able to develop this technology and attract the human resources that you need to create this really exciting kind of future of mapping?
Well, BC's actually had a great history of geographic companies. The government of BC invested a ton of money in the TRIM program and VRI programs to measure our forest resources. So there is a lot of innate geographic knowledge in this province. So that's where I'd start. Also, I think BC's got a great quality of life. Now we're not restricted to being anywhere in particular. People can live for their lifestyles more than their livelihoods, which I think is an incredibly powerful message. We're a remote company, so we're not limited by any means to BC. I live in I like to say I live north of the wall, and many people, sometimes judge the wall to be the 49th parallel. Sometimes they judge it to be just north of Vancouver, depending on their geographic kind of context. But nevertheless, I'm above it. But the point being that we're just a remote campus for anything that happens in San Francisco. So that's easy for us. We're in the same time zone as the biggest technology economy on Earth, which means we're just a Slack message, if you like, away from helping those guys do whatever it is they need to do. So BC has been a great spot for our company to grow. We do see an enormous amount of opportunity in the UK right now. So we're starting up an operation in the UK. I'm not saying by any means that we've tapped out what we can do in North America, because that isn't the case at all. But we do see a lot of opportunity across in the UK. So we're hardly sort of expanding over there, because we feel that the ability for all those satellite sensors to measure and monitor the effects of climate change is something that we want to be deeply involved with. And a lot of that monitoring is done through a financial lens. And a lot of that decision making is happening in London and New York. So we want to be present in those environments. And it's, frankly, just from a time zone perspective, it's pretty hard working over there from here. It's a lot of early mornings. So we need to have some people over there, and that's going to work out really well for us. Meanwhile, we simply can't hire enough staff in Canada, and we're very excited to be part of this new technology economy.
Well, it's pretty exciting, and as I point out, it's very new to me. So thanks for giving me a small glimpse into it, and anybody who watches the show gets a little bit of insight, but they can also go to your website and get more information.
Absolutely.
If they choose to pursue this. Thanks for joining me. I really appreciate it.
Thanks very much.